Good morning, everybody. We're just going to give it a couple minutes to let everybody come into the room before we get started. Good morning.
I thought you were presenting at the meeting today.
All right. Good morning. I'm Katie Hunt Thomas with the Ability Center of Greater Toledo, and I'm here with Christina Rodriguez to introduce this year's 5th annual ADA seminar, which is co-sponsored with the Fair Housing Center and put on as part of the Ability Center's Access Network. This year, our theme is promoting housing justice from full barriers to full community access for people with disabilities. A recent survey conducted by the Ability Center found that around 58% of respondents were not able to live in the neighborhood they would like to live in due to a lack of accessible housing and affordable housing. The scarcity of affordable, accessible, community-based housing is one of the major community barriers challenging people with disabilities' ability to live independently in our community. This year's seminar is meant to challenge our community to discuss this issue, learn about it, and develop community solutions. Christina?
Good morning. The Fair Housing Center is honored to co-sponsor this ADA seminar in partnership with the Ability Center. As a civil rights organization, we see firsthand the challenges people face when trying to find accessible housing. And in fact, the vast majority of fair housing complaints are based on disability discrimination. My name is Christina Rodriguez. I'm Senior Staff Attorney at the Fair Housing Center. And in that position, I oversee much of our work to enforce the Fair Housing Act. I am also a member of the Toledo-Lucas County Commission on Disabilities, and I know firsthand from assisting hundreds of clients over the years the importance of disability rights advocacy, the ADA, and the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Center works every day to overcome barriers to housing choice by assisting both residents and housing providers with accommodations and modifications that can make housing more accessible. By educating the community about their fair housing rights and advocating for policy changes, we also strive to achieve a broader impact across the community. We appreciate this opportunity to join in this important conversation about how to build an inclusive, welcoming community where everyone can find housing that meets their needs. Thank you for being here and for your interest in the ADA and housing. So now I'll turn it over to Brittany Maddox from the Ability Center. She's going to provide some housekeeping and then we'll moderate our first panel.
And I think, I'll jump in with a couple housekeeping. So this session is the first of 6 over the next 2 weeks. If you haven't already, we'd recommend that you take a look at the other sessions that are available. There is a link to our website in the chat that has all sessions and materials. Our sessions are captioned. There's a live transcript button at the bottom of your screen that you can push in order to get captions. And then because we've been approved for continuing education credits, there will be some polling questions that pop up on your screen to monitor attendance. When you receive them, just fill them out and we'll get on with the seminar. Our first session today is a panel of our wonderful panelists to discuss best practices in local housing policy. Brittany Maddox is going to be moderating the panel. She's a disability rights advocate with the Ability Center. She comes to the center from Washington, D.C., and she calls Toledo home now. She graduated in 2021 from the University of Toledo with a Bachelor of Arts in Disability Studies and a minor in Women and Gender Studies. So go ahead, Brittany. I look forward to seeing this panel.
Hi, okay, thank you guys so much. I'm so excited to be here and to also moderate this very esteemed panel. So to kick us off, I would ask if everyone can go ahead and introduce themselves. And I will start with, I can call out names just to make it easier. Director Clemens, would you like to go first?
Yes, thank you, Brittany. Good morning, everybody. I am Clemens. I serve as the director of the City of Toledo's Department of Housing and Community Development. I've been in that role for about 2 years now and been in Toledo for about 3 years. The Department of Housing and Community Development is the lead housing and community development policy entity here in the city. We collaborate with a variety of partners that are working in this space, and we have the fiduciary responsibility of managing all federal and state entitlement dollars that come to the city for housing and community development. We also are very aggressive in seeking competitive funding, non-entitlement funding, and that we do grant writing for housing and community development needs. And we also manage those funds. Our work is focused on housing preservation, home ownership, housing stability services, and of course, affordable housing development. So we do a variety of things to promote housing and community development. And of course, that impacts our residents in the city who are disabled. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Director Clemens. Mr. Hart, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Who did you say, sorry?
If you could go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Michael Hart. I don't do a good job of paying attention all the time, but I'm the executive director at the Toledo Lucas County Homelessness Board. We serve as a lead agency for the local homelessness response system and work with a variety of partners and collaborating to ensure that we're providing equitable access to all sorts of services that individuals experiencing homelessness or at risk of experiencing homelessness may need. So that might include supportive services, that might include the provision of emergency shelter, and then of course, connecting individuals to affordable housing opportunities and accessing those opportunities. We take our role as a collaborator in this community very seriously. And that extends not just to our partners in this space, but to the entire community. I personally want to show up as not just an ally, but an accomplice to any of our marginalized neighbors in our community. And that's how our agency approaches this work. We know that there are great disparities on a number of levels within the homeless population. And certainly, those who are living with both visible and invisible disabilities are among those who are disparately reflected in that population. So our work is to ensure that we're lifting everybody up and ensuring equitable access to all of those services, which we'll talk more about that later. But we really want to work and walk alongside all of the community and all of our neighbors. So we're happy to be here today.
Awesome, thank you so much. Councilmember Komives, would you like to go next?
Sure, good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today to uplift this conversation. I've been serving on City Council for 5 years now. Happy to have been reelected last year. And I think much of it because of the focus that has been put on affordable housing in our space and environmental justice, which impacts people with disabilities at higher rates. And I think the reality is that for all of us, this topic is quite important because it is emblematic of who we are and who we are as a city. So proud to be a part of this work and work with the Ability Center nearly every day in the work that we do. Prior to being on council, I was the executive director of Equality Toledo, an LGBT rights organization. I worked on the National Marriage Campaign before that. and prior to that focused on voting rights and access to polling locations for about 10 years with an organization called America Votes. So I've been in this space for a long time, fighting for rights for folks. Happy to partner not just with the Ability Center, but also in my work, I partner often with the ABLE, LAWO, the Homelessness Board, many others throughout the community to especially focus on affordable housing issues. So really happy to be here today. Excited to talk about the work. I don't want to get into it too much, but this panel, the folks that are on this panel are really responsible for a lot of progressive policy that the city has seen. Quite a proliferation of it, I would say, in the last 5 years. And I'm really proud of all the folks that are here. So happy to join these folks in this conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, and so last but not least, Mr. Mackin, would you like to introduce yourself today?
Good morning. I'm Tom Mackin. I'm Chief Administrative and Legal Officer for Lucas Metropolitan Housing. I've been Chief Legal Officer for approximately 7 years. Lucas Metropolitan Housing is the largest landlord in Northwest Ohio. We serve our clients who have varying degrees of issues that make their need to obtain safe, affordable housing a critical part of their obtaining stability for them and their families. LMH serves its customers, its clients, through 2 programs, a low-income housing program where we are the landlord. So we feel an interesting space here. We are both an advocate and also a landlord who has to address the issues of affordable housing. We also provide assistance to participants in the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So we're very excited to be a part of this discussion. We're glad that you're here to listen and to learn. And we think this is a great opportunity to address the numerous issues that are facing homeless and people with disabilities in this community, especially given the shortage of housing nationally and in Toledo. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for that. So our next question that we have, and I would ask everyone to answer this one. What has been your role in developing local housing policy, and what are your main goals? And whoever wants to jump in first can go ahead.
Well, I'll just jump in and say that, you know, at a basic level, in terms of housing policy, at the continuum of care, we have to have written standards that comport with HUD requirements and HUD regulations that help us guide how our coordinated entry system works, how individuals are, you know, have access, assessment, prioritization, and referral for all of these resources. Of course, we work very closely with the city of Toledo as they develop their consolidated action plan and the CAPER. And then, of course, through different funding opportunities, you can set the tone of, you know, what are the standards of services that are being provided in our community and so forth. So, you know, at a very basic level, you know, that's where it really starts in terms of how we communicate those standards out to the community. And, you know, in that, in accomplishing some of those goals to ensure that these resources are low barrier, that they're accessible, we then turn to our partners in government and those policymakers to see if there are ways we can change local code or laws or the ways we do things or how things are enforced, and really just approach it from all angles. So, you know, I just wanted to highlight that there's a programmatic level where we can, you know, push policy changes as well. And then, of course, other people on this call can talk more about changing policy and how we do things at that level.
So I want to talk about the groundbreaking work that the city has moved forward in during the last year and a half. For the first time, we have developed what is called a comprehensive housing policy for the city of Toledo. It's called Toledo Together, a guiding vision and 10-year action plan for housing. We were joined in this effort by over 60 stakeholders in the housing space, developers, bankers, nonprofits, and citizens, to develop this comprehensive strategy. It looks at housing needs of various populations in the city. It looks at the gaps for different types of housing. It looks at the funding, the lay of the land for funding, and it provides unlike a lot of plans, it provides an action plan, a roadmap, if you will, for where we want to take housing here in the city of Toledo. And I think what it has done is it's affirmed that we have a significant gap for affordable housing here in the city, over 12,000 units for low and moderate income residents. And it's also, I think it's elevated the discussion in the city of why affordable housing is so important. People talk affordable housing. I think people think that it is Section 8 housing or it's public housing. Affordable housing is simply housing that you're not paying more than 30% of your income on. And that's the message of this study. And if you have a city where housing, people say, well, housing is cheap in Toledo. It's not expensive when you look at Columbus or you look at the East Coast. Well, our incomes are lower here. And despite the fact that housing is relatively less expensive here, the incomes of our residents are lower, and therefore housing becomes unaffordable for them. So what this study did is really define it was unanimously adopted by our council in October of 2021, and we are aggressively moving forward to check off those recommendations that are included in this study. So I think when you look at policy development, this is really significant for this city. And again, it sets the tone of where we want to take housing during the next 10 years. I will go into some of those recommendations later on in the presentation. And I have a link, Brittany, for the study for those participants who may want to access it. I'll put a link in the chat for those participants that want to access the study.
Okay, thank you.
So I guess I'll go next. My role has been trying to be the best advocate that I can be as a member of City Council. I remember one of the very first voter forums that I attended as a candidate when I was first running was put on by the Disabilities Center, and I learned an awful lot about several policies that they had been fighting for some time. Including protections around source of income, non-discrimination for people who might be seeking housing and might be a voucher holder, all the way to can we provide closed captioning for folks when they're in public spaces on televisions that are on in those sports bars or wherever. So, certainly it illuminated an awful lot of work that needed to be done and felt that we were ready. So as soon as I was on council, I made an effort to reach out to organizations like the Ability Center to find out how I could best advocate for these policies. And later we're going to talk a little bit about a tenant rights protection group that we started at the beginning of COVID. And I just want to say that has also been instrumental in progressing a lot of policy that we've seen here in the city of Toledo. It's a group of many organizations, several that are represented here, but all throughout Toledo that includes some landlords and tenants and various advocacy groups. And so try to do as much as we can to assess what's happening on the ground at all times. So we meet every 2 weeks specifically to talk about housing related issues that all of these organizations are facing, and then work together to develop policy that we try to implement through city council. So I'll talk more about it later in the conference.
Thank you. Mr. Mackin, would you like to go next?
Yes. Sorry, I'm traveling. I apologize for so just hold on a second. Well, if you don't mind learning about travel information, I would just say that the most important thing that we can accomplish, I think, from these discussions is that there needs to be a holistic approach to all the issues that are facing the housing crisis, and that these issues include a perspective that acknowledges the different interest groups so as to protect them and also to value them so that they can find solutions. Landlords are who are participating in the Housing Choice Voucher Program want to make money, but also want to provide fair, affordable housing. So one of the things that LMH is really trying to do is to, like everyone else has said, build collaboration, work with partners to address which is a real issue of shortage, because there are barriers to housing, not just physical barriers, but also structural barriers in how we do business that make it difficult for people to find housing. And so I think that that's one of the best things that we can accomplish out of this is to network and to make sure that everybody is on the same page, working through the various issues to make it easier for people to provide housing and easier for people to find housing.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah. And so the next question that I want to go, I'm going to direct this to Director Clemens and Mr. Hart as we get into it, talking about how do you go about getting public input and what have you learned from that process?
I'll defer to Director Clemens to go
Well,
first.
we because we manage federal and state funds, there are strict requirements on how you engage the residents and the public input that is required for development of your plans, particularly our consolidated plan and our annual plan that describes how we spend federal dollars. We are required by our citizens participation plan. We are required to provide public notices. We provide those notices whenever there is a planning process in the various papers of record. We advertise in the Blade, La Prensa, the Truth. We do press releases. We've started really engaging our council to make sure that these notices go out to their constituents. We have a neighborhood navigator on my team that regularly attends all of the neighborhood and block watch meetings in the city, and she tries to advertise those events. Our team constantly goes out to the libraries and are there sometimes to provide technical assistance on access to various programs. I can say though that engagement and the attendance to these events are not where I want them to be. I think citizens in Toledo, a lot of them feel unempowered. A lot of them have not been able to understand or what's available to them. So it's very disappointing sometimes when you do all of this advertisement, you go to these meetings, you have maybe 5 or 6 residents there. And when you are deliberating on how you're going to spend millions of dollars, you don't have the participation, and COVID certainly did not make that any better. I think it's a challenge for all of us on this call to figure out how we can really increase the access and the effectiveness of in terms of getting public participation in our decision making. We mentioned that we had over 60 stakeholders that participated in the housing strategy development, but it took a lot of emails, it took a lot of calls, it took a lot of corralling to get those people there. And when you come to the citizens level, people, it's a tough thing. I think we need to do a better job at it. We constantly work with Engage Toledo to make sure that they understand our programs, they understand access. But again, I think working with the Ability Center and other groups, we need to decide how we can increase public participation in our work. It's just something that I found is something that can be enhanced considerably.
Yeah, and while we are not, a participating jurisdiction, we're not, a government entity. We don't have entitlement money in the continuum of care, much the same as Director Clemens referenced. We do have rules and regulations in terms of how we organize ourselves and how we collaborate and coordinate as a homeless response system. Right now, we're going through a strategic planning process, and in the next few months, we're going to be discussing a governance charter that really defines the role of the continuum of care board. And so that can include a number of providers. It can include government entities that are funders in this space, but importantly, it must include those with lived experience, or rather lived expertise. So for us, underneath that governance structure, that COC board, which would work with my agency to ensure that we're advancing the priorities and the policies and the procedures that the community wants. We also look at our coordinated entry system at a committee level to ensure all of those processes are equitable. And again, that's access, that's assessment, prioritization, and referral that we're talking about to resources. We have a committee that looks at quality and performance of the data, and are we really capturing the true picture of what homelessness looks like in our community. And then I think more importantly, to go back to those with lived experience, we are part of a HUD's coordinated entry equity demonstration round 2, excuse me, which is a national competitive application process where Lucas County went in with 7 other communities in Ohio. And we are working with all of those communities to build a framework, both at a state level and at a local level, on how we can integrate those with lived experience and center our work through a race equity lens in particular. And race equity is important because we see a highly disproportionate representation of people and communities of color in our subpopulation of homelessness, but also just in general, we need to have an equity lens across the board and ensure that everybody is being accounted for and being included and having a voice at the table. So we've established locally a race, equity, and access core committee that is driven by those, what we call our internal system experts, those individuals with lived experience, and we provide a stipend for those individuals to participate in this work. And what we find is when you engage those with lived experience who actually understand how these programs, how these procedures, how these policies impact their lives, impact their ability to access resources, that is the most powerful tool. There's no research paper, there's no training that you can go through to get that type of perspective, and that's really important to what we're doing, and we're trying to center everything we do in that way. So we try to be very intentional. That includes both of our partners, our funders, but most importantly, those with lived expertise who have lived it, who understand it from a perspective that many of us simply cannot. So those are some of the things we try to do, and of course we work with many of our partners, including the city, to do that work.
Can I just add to that? One of the things that I've seen is that whether it's access to housing, whether it is funding modifications, whether it is new construction of affordable housing, whether it's just repairing a house that's in your neighborhood, there's a certain baseline of capacity that you need to move forward to get funding to do that work. And what I see here in the city of Toledo is that the same organizations are the same ones that keep applying for funding and keep getting funding, keep supporting their staff. There needs to be a more aggressive attempt to build the capacity across neighborhoods, across populations, to access funding to get this work done. The bottom line is it takes money to do the work that we need to do. So, one of the things that we have done is to start what is called a Neighborhood Capacity Building Institute. And we had our first cohort that came in this year. We're training these individuals. you know, if you feel, for example, that there's a small apartment complex in your neighborhood that's not accessible, okay, it's not accessible, but you've got folks that need the housing there. What can I do as a neighborhood group? How do I get money to do that? Some of these people don't have a clue as to where to start. They know the problem exists, but they don't know how to go about it. So, you know, this work requires us to, and I'm not talking about going back to the days where we had a dozen CDCs operating. I'm talking about building that sort of a line of defense in our community where our groups, our neighborhood groups know how and can successfully go after and get some of these funds to accomplish some of these things that we know are needed in this neighborhood, in these neighborhoods. There is a lack of capacity in that regards, and we've got to focus on building that. Basic things like, how do you write a letter of interest to a philanthropic organization to get funding to do some work in your neighborhood? A lot of these people these groups can't do it because they haven't been trained how to do it. So this is the work that we want to do at that grassroots level to help our folks to access resources that can impact affordable housing and impact accessibility, and impact how their community looks.
Thank you both for that. That was really, really insightful. And I think kind of jumping off of that to get deeper into it, I'm going to turn to Councilmember Komives. I wanted to ask both of you, well, Mr. Mackin had to hop off, so it'll be just you, Mr. Komives, but you've been part of Toledo's tenant protection work group. So can you describe how it works? What's one lesson you've learned from operating or being part of a group aimed at developing housing policy?
Yeah, thanks for this question. One of the things I've learned, certainly since being on council, is how important the community input is, right? And how important listening is. And in that vein, two sort of groups like this have popped up in my life since being on council. One was a consumer protection group that we set up around water, which also I think deals with housing, certainly because we talk about affordability and people's utilities. But the other was specific to housing. And the tenant protection group specifically started at the beginning of COVID, because the reality was at the very beginning, if you recall, there were no moratoriums on evictions, and many people lost their jobs very quickly and found themselves in a situation that they might not have ever faced before. The folks that were already on the margins were impacted heavily, but a lot of folks maybe had steady employment their whole lives and now saw themselves facing eviction. So we really wanted to see what we could do to prepare as the world was drastically changing. And so myself and Councilmember Gaddis, along with the Homelessness Board, the Ability Center, Abel, Lao, who else is on this call? Mike, help me out. But we meet every 2 weeks to really talk about on the ground issues that are impacting renters, but also landlords. We hear from landlords as well in that group. And the idea is that, all of these agencies are obviously serving people throughout the community, and in many cases, people who are less likely to engage with their government because they have many other things to be concerned with before they might rise to that level, or they feel disenchanted, disheartened by government, a lack of trust in government. And so they're relying on folks to carry that message. And so it's been really impactful to be a part of this group, to have this group come together, because we focus in many areas, but I would say specifically first on direct service. It's great to bring all the providers together. I think there are many avenues for them to do so. But especially in this group, we've been able to really kind of talk about, when an issue arises in our community, like mobile home park that maybe is really back on its water bill because the owner of the property hasn't been keeping up. And so what are we going to do with all the folks that are housed there? I mean, we were a direct response team that helped work with all the agencies, and big thanks to Mike Hart and his team for really kind of pulling through during that time. But it's been a way that we can all combine our efforts and really talk with one another on how we can strengthen the work that we're all doing in our individual lanes. But then also the great part about having council members present in that conversation is that, you know, we're directly hearing about the policies that could hopefully help to impact or change the course of life for a lot of folks in our community, because we're hearing directly from the service providers exactly about what policies are lacking, what enforcement is necessary, whatever, you know, changes might need to happen. And so we've been able to take action. We've in fact passed 9 ordinances as a group through the Senate Protection Group. And the other thing, it's not just about passing the policy, it's also about doing our best to educate folks and also build advocacy in the community, because all of these groups then reach out to their various, you know, constituents or people that turn to them for advice or guidance. And we do our best to turn them into community advocates as well, and have them come and testify at council meetings, maybe come to a community meeting, participate in a Zoom call where we're learning a little bit more about what they'd like to see. So it's been great. It's been a great way for us to connect directly to people who might not already want to or have access to interact with their government, and then also be able to advocate collectively that impact all of the folks that these organizations serve, which ultimately serves, you know, to benefit our entire city.
Awesome, thank you. And I don't know, Mr. Hart, did you want to add anything to that at all?
I think Councilman member Komives said it well. You know, I think if we've gotten better at anything in this community, it's collaborating and working together, trying to break down silos. And everybody at that meeting and frankly everybody on this call has a different perspective. So, you know, whereas we see it from, you know, on the ground, you know, boots on the ground perspective often with our providers, you know, maybe Director Clemens has a more global view on certain issues. So bringing all of those perspectives together, I think helps us be better at advocating and helps us be more thoughtful and pragmatic about how we approach those issues. And I think we've struck a good balance with that.
I'd like to, Brittany, if I may, I'd like to add a little bit to this issue here. I think we do a good job at advocacy, and it's always good to have advocacy. We've done a great job here in the city of Councilmember Komives mentioned. We passed 9 different tenant protection ordinances. I think what Toledo needs to get better at is programming and execution of advocacy, execution of a plan of action that implements or enforces these ordinances. And I guess that's the role that we've tried to step into here. How can we take this great advocacy, take these great ordinances, and make sure that we have concrete programs that our folks can access and benefit from? One of the things that we are very proud of, one of the major recommendations of the housing strategy was that you've got a lot of partners working in the fair housing space and in the tenant protection space, but the city has no programming for tenant protections here. And while our council members are fighting for this, where are the programs to implement these things? Where does somebody go if they feel that they've been discriminated against for a source of income? They go to fair housing, but how can we strengthen that? So, and I always say this city is almost 50% renters, 50% homeowners, but yet historically, we don't have a program citywide that we've stood up that supports tenants. So the housing strategy recommended this, and with the blessing of Nick and other people on the council, we are going to be bringing on a tenant services manager. And that person will be the one to bring all of these stakeholders together. She'll have her advisory committee. Maybe she can use the existing tenant protection working group as her advisory committee. We want her to be able to put programs in place that will give teeth to these ordinances and bring resources to implementing these tenant protection ordinances. So we are very proud that the strategy recommended this. We're very proud that our council supported this, and that individual will be coming on board on the 31st of October. So you'll begin to see some senior level help to the advocacy to drive the implementation and the execution of these tenant protection things that are now on our books.
Okay, thank you for that addition. That was great. Thank you. And I'm actually going to turn back over to you, Director Clemens, for our next question. And I know it was touched on briefly earlier by someone else, but what disability-specific policies have you implemented or attempted to implement?
Well, if you look at and I did put a link in the chat for the housing strategy. Strategy 2.11 of the comprehensive strategy talks specifically about us developing policy and programs to increase accessibility. What are the accessibility requirements now? If you look in the Toledo Municipal Code, there are visibility requirements for new construction, for example, that has public funds. Well, what if there are no public funds in the project? You know, what are the accessibility standards? So the strategy talked about specifically, how do we move this discussion forward? How do we look at our planning process? How do we look at what we have on the ground to increase accessibility? And that's huge. That's going to take a working group. A lot of communities are moving towards universal design. You don't just have to give 3 units that are mobility accessible, or you've got to design your project in a manner where it achieves universal design. That takes a working group to work with our planning folks, working with our local architects to really move Toledo in the direction where everything we build, whether it's publicly subsidized or not, everything we build should have universal design. And that takes time to do. It takes advocacy, it takes education. What is universal design? How do you achieve it? There's money involved. You've got to give some incentives to make this happen, especially if you look at the market here in Toledo. So the strategy recommended that we move in that direction. And with the help of the Ability Center and the groups that are participating, we really want to set up a work group to start planning or working on this issue, moving the entitlement process, moving the permitting process or the land use requirement process to a situation where we achieve universal design here in the city. The other thing is increased resources. A lot of our housing stock was not built for accessibility, especially the older apartment buildings that have 20 units or less, even some of those that have larger number of units, they're not accessible. So what do we do? What are the resources that we can access to achieve accessibility, not just on the 1 unit, 2 unit, 3 unit types residential, but on some of our smaller apartment buildings? Where are those resources that we can access? How do we get them in place? How do we develop programs? And the other thing is, going back to this education and outreach and public participation, when we develop these programs, how do we get folks who need them to understand that they exist, and how do we get them to access those services? So again, achieving a universal design standards, increasing resources for home modifications, and an easier process for folks for disabled folks to access these resources. For example, our home rescue program that we're doing in partnership with Habitat, on the average, we're spending about $70,000 to substantially rehab a property. In Junction now, where we've started this program, I think we've rehabbed to date over 20 properties. And we're continuing to do this work. And one of the things that we're doing as we do this work, we go in, if there's someone that needs a ramp, we put that ramp in. If there's someone that needs lower cabinets, we put those lower cabinets in. We put grab bars in the bathroom. So every house that we do now, if you look at our rehab standards, every house that we do, if accommodations are necessary, we're putting those accommodations in. And it is, you say, well, 20 some houses that you've done in the junction is a drop in the bucket, but the model has been established. And every time we do this work, we will not just bring the house up to code, but if accommodations are needed, we will make sure that those things occur. The other thing too is pivoting how we use our CDBG dollars. CDBG allows folks to apply if they're for CDBG dollars if they're making ADA accommodations. This is something that I've told my staff that we need to make sure people understand and start promoting that, because using CDBG in this manner can also help advance this cause of making our housing and our public facilities more accessible. We are doing the city is doing a community center assessment now for 8 of our centers here in the city. And one of the priorities of that assessment is to look at the accessibility of each one of those community centers. And you know, if in fact the assessment shows that they're not accessible, we're going to spend money on making those community centers accessible. So again, it is in concert with the recommendation of the housing study that we've got to develop more policies and programs to increase accessibility. We're looking at how we can deploy existing resources for ADA modifications, and how do we work with the community groups like yours to move us in the direction of universal design, and what will that take in terms of policy changes and funding incentives.
And me next, is it Brittany?
I will, it'll be Councilmember Komives, and then if you can add after. Thank you.
So yeah, I think I want to start by saying several years ago, I think 3 years ago, the city council approved and created a disability manager position within the city, or director, I believe. And I'm really excited to see where that goes. The person who filled that role, Valerie Fatika, is often moving quickly, which is really great, and so excited to have her join our team here in Toledo, and is already undergoing a process to evaluate not just the community centers, but just all city buildings in general, to see how they stand when it comes to accessibility. And so it's definitely a focus of the city of Toledo. One of our council members, Sam Meldon, has declared that he would like to see Toledo as the most disability friendly city in America. So there's nobody is arguing that we shouldn't do that within city council. And so I think we're all moving in that direction. So it's really great to see. You know, I admittedly, I'm going to say this because I think it's important. Most of the focus of what we have done in the last several years in terms of policy is focused on low income folks, or you know, folks that were struggling due to COVID. And so I don't want to equate the work that we do around disability rights with poverty, but the reality is that in the face of COVID, we focused mostly on affordability issues or debt issues that folks were carrying, or access to the justice system. And so most of the policies that we passed as of late touch on that. And so we've already mentioned source of income. You know, one of the funny things about when I first joined council was I was naive, and I was that young lawmaker, that green lawmaker that just thought, well, if it's a good thing, it'll pass, right? So I introduced source of income non-discrimination protections, and it failed miserably the first time that I brought it forward. But the second time it did indeed pass, a lot because of the tenant protection group that we talked about coming out to advocate for it. and really, I think, showcasing the work that LMH is doing with the voucher program. But it also took us making sure that LMH was on the ball with the voucher program. There were a lot of complaints from landlords that the process was lengthy and arduous, and that LMH wasn't keeping up with it. And we all came around the table to have a discussion about what that looks like. And fortunately, LMH heard that and said, great, we will do all we can. And I think has been doing a great job of administering our voucher program over the last several years. We have a large number of folks who have vouchers and can't find housing, and it's quite unfortunate, of course. So adding these protections is important. As Director Clemens mentioned, it is important to also have enforcement. So fortunately, everybody that has a voucher has to go through LMH, so we're able to somewhat root out this issue, but monitoring every posting for a house that says no vouchers allowed is a lengthy and difficult process to undergo. Enforcement of that is a little bit more difficult. However, just passing the policy really set a signal to folks throughout our community that it's unacceptable to deny somebody housing who can't afford the housing. Just being on a voucher is not a reason to not have housing. So we were fortunate to pass the source of income protections. We also passed an ordinance called pay to stay. Especially during COVID, a lot of folks were finding themselves introduced to the eviction process for the first time. Once an eviction has started in Ohio, a landlord can follow it through regardless of whether or not you
I think you froze and cut out.
pay your back rent or not. And so to offer a defense for folks who, sorry, I'm turning on the council, which provides an attorney to folks. Hi.
Hello.
So sorry.
That's okay.
Were you talking, Mike?
No.
You were cutting out, and so we didn't get the last bit of what you were saying. It was kind of glitchy.
Sorry about that. Internet. But so we also passed right to counsel, which was a piece that provides an attorney for folks who are facing an eviction. And then the last thing that I would mention is there were also a number of policies passed around water that were important during this time too, pertaining to affordability. So we now have a grant program for folks to access money should they have difficulty paying their water bills. We offer a program around debt forgiveness that helps people who might have found themselves falling behind, especially during COVID, on their water bills. And we will forgive their debt if they enter into the program and follow the steps. And then, of course, our work around lead pipes and replacement and offering that for free to anybody in the city of Toledo is also really impactful and important in this space. And all of these policies that I just mentioned were in partnership with the community groups that we mentioned earlier, Fair Housing Center, Able Lawo, and then especially the Ability Center. And so been really proud to partner with these groups. And in light of what I mentioned earlier, that most of the focus has been on these issues that might impact folks that are in low income folks. We are now focusing how else can we move forward these issues. So I really love to hear Director Clemens talk about universal design, of course. We've been engaged a little bit in some conversations around at least percentage of units that are accessible in new developments. And so trying to get that conversation off the ground. Most recently, we passed the closed captioning ordinance that requires all public spaces to offer closed captioning on any televisions that are on within a business. But also we made sure that we as a city council were accessible and offer closed captioning on all of our meetings now, which was something that we didn't do before necessarily unless somebody requested it. but we just determined at this point that it's just prudent for us to just offer closed captioning at all times, of course. So we will continue our focus moving forward on policies that can help make the city better for all of us. And as you can tell, we have good partnerships happening. So there's a lot of good momentum, and I'm really proud of all of the folks around the table who are making these things happen. Thanks for dealing with my technical glitches. Sorry.
That's okay. And I'll turn it over to Mr. Hart. If you want to piggyback off of that question as well, but I would also ask you what you would count as your greatest success in improving access to housing for people with disabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was skipping ahead to that question in my head, but it'll piggyback well off of what we just heard. So in 2017, the Mental Health and Recovery Services Board, along with the county commissioners, the city of Toledo, and a number of other partners throughout the homeless response system, started really seriously looking at the framework of housing first. And housing first as a concept is simple in its design, but sometimes difficult to understand the nuance and how it interplays with all the different types of project types and services that we might apply it to. Sorry, there's a siren outside. The long story short, the concept of housing first is that we seek to connect individuals to housing as quickly as possible with as few barriers and prerequisites as possible. But the key thing there is once individuals have secured housing and are in that environment, we then ensure that appropriate supportive services are available to continue that journey to maintain and sustain that housing. And the evidence shows overwhelmingly throughout the country that this model is effective, it works, and it has a low recidivism rate. So together, the community came together and built out a framework of what that looks like. Now, that can be a project type in terms of how we do permanent supportive housing. In other words, housing that has those supportive services attached to it. But, it can also be a framework and a mentality of how we approach this work, how we think about our policies, our procedures. Are there barriers that we're creating in terms of how we do intake? Is there barriers? Geez Louise, I apologize. I am in, give me 1 second. I'm sorry, I am in Columbus today with the Corporation for Supportive Housing at their institute. And so I'm in a room trying to be here with you all today, but apparently they do their sirens on different days. My point is we developed what we call the No Barriers Housing framework, which is really grounded in housing first principles, which again is person-centered and it's based on harm reduction. So the idea is that we provide housing, we ensure services are available, but we trust that person to understand what they need and what their situation requires. And out of that, we developed a scattered site, so open market voucher program with the Housing Authority specifically for those experiencing chronic homelessness. And chronic homelessness is defined by HUD is an episode of homelessness equaling a year or a total amount of homelessness over a 4-year period that equals a year, along with a severity of service needs, so high service needs, and that's done through assessment. So those are a couple policies we were able to implement locally that helps provide access to those vouchers. But to Director Clemens' point, we need more housing to be able to do that. So I mentioned I'm down here in Columbus talking about supportive housing today and learning about it. And, somebody commented to me that there was a 10-year gap where you really didn't see much coming out of the city of Toledo. And really in the past 3 years, and she says I try to flatter her too much, but, Director Clemens has really led the charge and turning that ship around, and people around the state are noticing that as well. So that is the critical piece at the end of the day.
Let me just add to this. For the first time in the city, we have, I call it an unprecedented pipeline of projects. Over 10 projects are in the pipeline that 600 units that we hope to deliver in the next 3 years. That is significant, folks, when it comes to affordable housing. Now, what I think is a low-hanging fruit, all of these projects are getting federal dollars, are getting OFA tax credits. And here today, the minimum that they are required to give are 3 units designed for the mobility impaired, 1 unit for sensory impaired, and the rest of the units has to be visitable to mobility impaired individuals. Well, how can we push these 10 projects? How can we push them so that they give us more units? I would like the Ability Center to look at every single one of the plans for these units, because they're begging for money for gap financing. How can we push them? Can we get, instead of 3 units, can we get 6 units? And what difference will that make in terms of your funding gap request? Maybe we can work together so that we're getting ready to close Warren Commons. And had we done this with Warren Commons, maybe instead of putting $750,000 in Warren Commons, we put $900,000, but we get double the amount of double the amount of mobility impaired units. So I think with the pipeline that we have, let's vow to work with the developers, work with the city to kind of get more, to push the envelopes on these numbers so that at least we're delivering these 10 projects and we've succeeded. I mean, before we get to universal design and all that stuff, what can we do with these projects? How can we provide some incentives so that we get more units for our disabled population? So that is what I would like us to work on, eyes on each one of these and push so that we can double the amount of units that are required and get them as we work to close these 10 projects.
Awesome, thank you for that. And actually, Councilmember Komives, if you don't mind, I would also pass this question to you as well.
Sure. I would like to hope that my greatest achievement in this space has not yet happened because I think there's so much more work to be done. And so I'm hopeful. I kind of ticked off the list a little bit already of the things that we've worked on, and I have to agree with Mike that I think that a lovely sort of perfect storm of things has occurred over the last 3 years, and that is, I think, bringing a director to the city who is thoughtful, intentional, and centers a lot of this work around the folks living on the margin. I'm not just talking about people with disabilities, I'm talking about in any marginalized space. So just I think that happening along with a definite alignment of the advocacy groups and really working together. And then I think just making the bridge that exists between the advocacy groups with government, right? I mean, I think that, I'm sure the administration and Director Clemens sometimes get frustrated with council for passing certain things, and that's healthy. I think, we're separate branches of government, so that happens. And I think that, while all of these things are happening, we're all actively pushing it in a direction, right? In the same direction. And so while, there still might be some pieces that are moving in their own spaces, the reality is that we're all moving forward together, and it's a really exceptional time for us, because I think that we're making a lot of we're not just creating policy, we're not just investing in housing, we're also telling a story. We're also creating what our future and our story is going to look like. And I think it's really a powerful moment for us. So if I had to bring it all into one, I would say the greatest achievement so far would just be creating an avenue for advocacy groups to have a direct line to policymakers that not only allows for, but I would say, I'm not the expert in the room, and I admit that all the time. People expect me to know everything about everything, and the reality is that I turn to incredible people who live this experience every day, who advocate on behalf of people every day, and creating that avenue for them to be able to have input and create and develop the policy and then advocate on behalf of themselves, I think has been what I would consider my greatest achievement, if you will, in this space.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And I think we will head over to the Q&A shortly, but I would love to know, first, I'll encourage everyone to put more questions in the Q&A. It's down there on the bottom of your screen. There's a little box that says Q&A. I encourage everyone to ask some questions. But I would say while we wait for some more questions to pop in, if we could do kind of like a round robin and just do in 1 minute, just to kind of conclude the conversation, this part, what advice would you have for those advocating for best practices in housing?
I'll go first. And, I think simply, ask questions and don't be afraid to ask for a seat at that table. And everybody's perspective comes into play differently, as we talked about before. But ultimately, if you're on the provider side, okay, if you're not a citizen just wanting to advocate because you care about these issues, but this is your job and your profession, ask those who are impacted by these policies. Ask those who are actually living that experience, because I can tell you, as a young white man with plenty of privilege in my life, I do not have the perspective, I do not have the lens to understand everything I need to understand to do this work. So I have to empower and center the voices of those who do, and make sure that it's not just lip service. It's not just, hey, I'm going to tell you how this should go, but instead it's true listening. It's a true ear, and it's a true accomplice in this work. I think that's really important, to center those people with lived experience. But if you are that person, speak up, because your voice is very important.
Roz, you've been going like first all the time, so
Oh,
I'll let you.
Well, what I will,
whatever you were going to say will be far more profound.
well,
I just feel like we should let Roz close. She's the founder.
what I will say is that housing is it's not an easy thing to achieve housing for all. When I say housing for all, not just affordable housing, middle housing, housing for all. And you really, in your city, you really want to do that. If you want your city to be vibrant and you want people to come here, you've got to provide a spectrum of housing for all. And the ability to do that, there's several factors going on. It's not for want. It's not because the politicians or the mayor and his team, they don't want that to happen. It is a delicate, it's a complicated situation that is impacted by the market in the city. It's impacted by the funding that's available for this. It's impacted by your land use requirements that allow you to build certain things. So I think advocates, to the extent that we understand that there's so many factors that impact this. If you think a landlord simply doesn't want to make his property ADA accessible, maybe the rents that he's getting are so low that he can't even pay for that upgrade. He can't even pay to put in an elevator. So as we advocate for these things, we must be mindful that all parts of the picture that impact on our ability to be a city where we maximize access for the disabled and the homeless and all of these populations that we serve, we must be mindful that there are several pieces of this that we must work on simultaneously to get this work done. And to the extent that we understand that and we tackle these pieces, we will become successful for housing for all here in this city.
I would just say, you know, if you want to make a difference, hound the people that make the decisions. It was actually kind of surprising to me the few amounts of emails or contact I receive sometimes on various issues, and just how impactful the few number of folks who actually take the time to contact their lawmakers can have, because, you know, 5 emails can change a person's vote that quickly, because they might be the only 5 voices that actually said anything. So it does make a difference if you contact your lawmakers. You know, oftentimes we're faced with a wider array of issues, and you know, there's a lot of things to consider often, and what people, you know, what community members say to council members, to state lawmakers can make a difference. And so I would encourage you to show up and to make your voice heard, or find avenues for which that can be done, because not a lot of people are doing it. They're just not. And it can make a huge difference. So, you know, fortunately or unfortunately for me, people know that I love coffee, for instance, right? So people will just like find me in a coffee shop and start talking to me. But these are organizing tactics, right? Like I told you that I came from Equality Toledo, from America Votes. I trained organizers often in that work, and I would tell them, you know, you have to look at the sphere of influence around people that make decisions. Where do they hang out? Where do they go to church? Who do they talk to? Who are the people that make an impression on them, right? Find those things out, and then use it when you can. It will make.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. I know I have personally enjoyed this conversation and have learned a lot. So thank you for your time in doing this. So I will go ahead and we'll answer a few questions. So we have about 10 minutes left. So I will just start reading them off. And if we don't get to your question, you know, we will try at a later time to get you an answer to that. So first is a comment from Natalie Leak that says, Director Clemens, I agree with your point of view. Rising Heights has been a neighborhood group of parents of special needs kids, and we've had exactly the same challenge of how to approach high donors and foundations to secure funding for an ADA community in Greater Cleveland. I would love to learn more about your training and capacity building efforts. Thank you. Which I think leads to her question for Director Clemens is the capacity building training that you spoke about available virtually, because I think there would be a lot of people who would want to learn from you.
Well, it is available. The training has it had 21 modules. It's first time we did it in the city. With the cohort, 18 folks started in October of 2021. We're actually planning their graduation for November 2nd. So it's an application type. It's free. It's an application program. You apply, you talk about your community, what you want to do, what your visions are, what your challenges are, and then we pick a cohort of 18 people. So I think we did most of the sessions virtually because of COVID, and some of the sessions were in person. But it's available for, it's not open to the public. We've never considered opening up to the public or charging a fee. Maybe we should, but it's available to members of the cohort that we selected. So we'll be happy to share that model with you, and we'd be happy to consider when we start the new cohort to consider having other people join. I mean, I don't think there would be any problem with that. So we love to share with you. And one of the things we try to do with this, the modules, the typical things: how to write a LOI, how to write a proposal, how to do a CDBG application. We had Tom Gibbons come on and talk about the land use planning process, because what we were seeing is a lot of the folks in the underserved neighborhoods don't show up for plan commission meetings. They don't come. They don't come and testify. They don't come and ask questions. So we sort of acquainted them with that process. We brought in a housing developer, affordable housing developer, to talk about the process. We're bringing in a supermarket, because a lot of these communities are food deserts, and people don't understand why supermarkets make the decision to come or to leave a neighborhood. So we wanted to bring that perspective. Why is it that I don't have a grocery store in my neighborhood? So we have somebody come on who makes a site selection decision. So the goal is to provide information that these neighborhood activists need to help them to fund or to move their agenda to a higher level. So we'll be happy to share this with them, because we think that it's a model. And then you go through the institute and you get a small grant that you can execute in your community. You write a grant, and we pick from that grant, and we give you a very small grant that you can execute in the community. So you're not only learning about all these issues, but you're learning how to write a proposal, get funding, and then we're providing oversight as you implement that small grant at the neighborhood level.
Okay. Thank you for that. The next question we have, which is, what is your advice for rural areas where the political entities, stakeholders, and housing stock is more dispersed?
Are you?
Anyone who wants to answer, I will just throw it out.
Well, I guess, I always tell people in a community, whether it's rural or not, you need to understand who owns property in your community. You need to understand what that property is zoned. And you need to be an ambassador for getting that property developed or getting that property rehabbed. It's not something that you can, if you just let it, because sometimes the market is not working. So you need to be an ambassador. My first job that I got when I got out of grad school, I worked for a woman who used to be the site selection person for the state of Virginia. And she had a map in her office, and that map had every single parcel in Loudoun County where I started my career. She had every single vacant parcel on that map, and she knew who owned it. And she worked that map. And that's what I tell community groups. Know the parcels in your neighborhood, know who owns those parcels, because that controls what happens in your neighborhood. So if you're in a rural area, find out who owns the parcels, find out what they're zoned, what can be done. Don't be afraid to approach the ownership for those parcels. So that's my advice. Don't always wait for people to come and bring you projects. As a community, understand the land in your community and understand what's its zone, and understand potentially how you can move that towards a housing project. It's not as difficult. It's easier than what it sounds. It's not that difficult to do.
I also, I grew up in Genoa, which is a rural part of Ohio. So that's my experience of coming from there. I will say that, what I have found, especially when I go back, I'm friends with the mayor of Genoa, so I still get to hear about what's happening out there. And, when I think the reality is that, we oftentimes like to think that urban settings and rural settings have distinct differences. And there are some, I would say, but I think on the whole, generally what lacks is just education on issues. And so for a lot of folks who, might not experience or think that they're experiencing something to do with various issues or, providing housing, it just might not be the forefront of their thought process. So, doing what you can to just sit down and have a conversation, bring people who to the table who have the lived experience, make sure that their voice is heard, right? So, I think these are things that can be done. There's a lot of the technical stuff that, like Director Clemens mentioned, in terms of knowing the land, know what tax credits are available, know what designations you can go after, know what, there's a number of those types of things that go, you have to educate yourself. But I think when it comes to political entities, or the folks making decisions, there's an awful lot of education to go around. And I think, just bringing them into that setting and having that conversation can go a long way.
I'll just very briefly tag onto that, another solution in terms of talking about dispersed housing, we have to recognize the intersectionality of public transit and transportation options and the ability to be mobile throughout the county, because that can also contribute to, lessening that impact of having dispersed, housing availability. So, we all know we've gone through a lot in this community in terms of our public transportation system. And, as we expand in the western part of the county, that's going to be critical to ensuring mobility moving forward. So that's another angle to look at it for. All of this is intersectional with other parts of the overall picture.
Yes, that's a good point. Thank you so much for adding that. I think we have time for one more question. So the next one is, someone mentioned a lot of this relies on new housing and LMH vouchers, and vouchers are almost impossible to get with the waiting list being closed after it passes the 3-year long mark. Is there any help for people who can't get a voucher?
Yeah, I will step in here for this one. Outside of my role at the Homelessness Board, I serve as a commissioner for Lucas Metropolitan Housing on their board. And I know another question asked about, what policy changes did we make in terms of those vouchers? We really started to attack a couple of things in terms of the special voucher program. So there's a mechanism in which we can ensure that people have a different level of access rather than just the single wait list to those vouchers. So we've created over 225 vouchers within special programs that are targeted to those who are chronically homeless, or perhaps those who are infant mortality related. So we're looking at young mothers or young families and ensuring that there's sustainability in their housing situation. Did I lose everybody?
Nope, we're still here. We can hear you.
Oh, okay. So one thing we have been working to do over the years is ensure that we are changing and lowering the barriers within the tenant selection plans for any voucher programs, whether it be project-based or.
Now we may have lost you. There we go. Okay.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
What I was saying is we've been working at the Housing Authority and partners throughout the community to eliminate and lower the barriers to be approved for those vouchers, whether it be project-based or tenant-based. The federal government requires that, you cannot manufacture meth, you cannot commit arson, and you cannot be a tier 1 sex offender. Those are the limits as far as the federal government goes. And so what we say is, how can we pull down the barriers that exist in various tenant selection? I don't know how much got out, but long story short, we can attack how we provide access to those vouchers. The Housing Authority is also, in partnership with the Homelessness Board, has also secured funding to bring on a landlord engagement specialist whose job it is to connect with private landlords in the market and ensure, we can provide as much access to units as quickly as possible. But there are some more frustrations. The inspection process takes too long. You know, the ability to get through the application process. It's a 23-page application at its most basic form. So that's a lot to deal with, and we really need to address those things. So there are some things we can do to make those vouchers a little more user friendly, so to speak. But certainly there are still challenges on that front. I hope I answered the question. I kind of lost my place as my screen went off a couple times.
That's okay. Director Clemens, did you want to add anything?
Well, I'm going to go out on a limb here. I see Nick smiling. Progressive jurisdictions have housing trust funds, and they deliberately, if you look at how we're funding, we're almost 99% reliant on the federal government, whether it's vouchers, whether it's new construction gap financing or home ownership. We are over reliant on the federal government, and progressive governments explore and find ways to support their housing priorities by taking on some of that responsibility. Housing levy, you establish a trust fund where you as a jurisdiction, you're generating funding revenue to support your priorities. So you have a trust fund, certain percentage of that trust fund goes towards fostering accommodations. Another percentage of that trust fund goes towards, there's jurisdictions that have their own voucher programs, that fund their own voucher programs. So, you know, it's a North Star idea that we need to move to in this city, because the housing need is so great, and the pot of money. Sure, we need to be more innovative with the existing pot of money, but we have to make that pot. We have to endeavor to make that pot bigger as we move forward.
Awesome, thank you. Well, I think that's the end of our Q&A. Thank you all so much. So I'll pass it on over to Katie.
Thank you.
You're on mute, Katie.
Thank you. I want to thank all of our panelists for making the time to be here this morning, and for everybody who was able to attend. We were really excited by the response we got for this seminar series. Over 100 folks registered, so it's exciting to see how many people across Ohio and even elsewhere are excited about advocating for more accessible, affordable, and integrated housing. And I thought that the presentations by all of our panelists were really so on point and wonderful. So thank you so much, for being here. That concludes this webinar. We would invite you to come to our next webinar in the series at 1 o'clock. George Thomas from the Fair Housing Center is going to be giving an overview of reasonable accommodations and modifications under the Fair Housing Amendments Act. It should be great. And we look forward to seeing everybody there. If you would like any of the materials, the transcripts, or the recording of this webinar, those are going to be available on the website that I dropped in the chat. So I look forward to seeing everybody at the next webinar, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having us. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.